I'm going to get this show started. So thank you for joining me here. I'm a painting conservator at the here at the Kimbell Museum. And thank you so much for joining me on such a beautiful day. So hopefully it'll be worth it. So today's lecture is all about this wonderful work in the Kimbell's collection by Giuseppe Maria Crespi, which I had the privilege of studying and conserving relatively recently. The cleaning restored the delicate and luminous qualities for which the artist is known for. Over the course of the next hour, I'm going to use the words vibrant, translucent, luminous, glazes, jewel tones on repeat. This is a good opportunity to briefly dive into the body of work of an exceptional painter who is not a household name, yet was one of the most accomplished painters of his generation. We'll also explore his exquisite painting technique, involving the sophisticated use of glazes, metal support, and unusual media outside of oil paint. Together, they create the enamel-like surfaces that are so admired in a Kimbell picture. Giuseppe Maria Crespi was an Italian late Baroque painter, and in terms of great artists of the 18th century, some consider him up there with Tiepolo, Piazzetta, Canaletto, and Guardi. The nickname Lo Spagnolo comes from his affinity for tight-fitting Spanish clothes. And that's the extent of it. He was an eclectic painter who worked in different styles and subjects across his career, but he was especially known for his caricatures and genre paintings. Born in Bologna in northern Italy, he also trained and worked there almost his entire career and founded an academy there. He rejected his classicizing academic training fairly early on and developed his own individualistic style. What probably limited Crespi's legacy was that he was one of the most stay-at-home painters among the prominent artists of his generation. He journeyed to Florence and Venice early on, but never to Rome, where prominent clients were. In fact, he turned down Carlo Maratta's invitation to work in Rome. He developed a wide clientele in Italy and Northern Europe, but refused to travel outside of Bologna for foreign patrons, even the Prince of Liechtenstein, who he politely declined by referring to another artist friend of his. That's how you kind of pawn off potential commission that you don't want to do. So after painting a ceiling fresco in Pistoia, he probably vowed, never again, I have a family, I'm working from home. Even this important portrait of Pope Benedict XIV, it mainly happened because just a year before, he was still Cardinal Prospero Lambertini, Archbishop of Bologna, in Crespi's neck of the woods. In the initial bozzetto, he is still in his cardinal attire, and there's extensive correspondence between the Vatican and Crespi in 1740 concerning the repainting of the vestments and additional papal insignias to the final portrait here. Among his most celebrated religious works is this series of imposing canvases depicting the seven sacraments. They are painted with bold, fluid, thick brushstrokes and dramatic lighting effects, but they still retain a sober piety. Rather than using saints and putti, the sacramental activities are illustrated by common folks in a direct, intimate manner. Here, Crespi paints with sincerity and tenderness. Even religious works betray his love of genre scenes. Today, Crespi is best known as one of the main proponents of Baroque genre painting in Italy. Until the 17th century, Italy, unlike Northern Europe, did not have a strong tradition in the depiction of everyday activities. The main themes would have been religion, mythology, and history. This exquisite lute player is the epitome of what Crespi was capable of, both in terms of his technical mastery and the sophistication of his genre scenes. Bologna, then and now, is an important music center where the likes of Mozart studied. Her turned-away profile, concentrating as she tunes her instrument, is so captivating that it comes as no surprise it resurfaces in later works, including in the Kimbell painting. Even the rare still life has a directness and sincerity that seems outright modern. As an interesting comparison, here's a painting currently on view in the Modern Art and Politics in Germany exhibition around the corner in the new objectivity section, painted 200 years later. This work was commissioned by Crespi's friend and lawyer Filippo Bonacci, which commemorates the blooming of a century plant in 1718. Over the next 40 years, Bonacci collected scientific data on this plant, as 18th century gentlemen do to pass the time. So Crespi translated street and kitchen scenes into visual poetry and represented laborers, domestic workers, and people from the lowest occupations with intimacy and humanity. Few artists had ever portrayed the grime and squalor of contemporary reality without resorting to satire. Here, a young woman is readying for sleep by grooming for a nagging flea. Her environment is squalid, but she is bathed in comforting light with a lapdog on her bed and her personal possessions scattered around her. And Crespi was widely regarded by his contemporaries, including his patrons, as a brilliant humorist with a quick mind and brush. His student days came to a sudden end when he offended the director of the Drawing Academy by caricaturing him as a dead chicken. So this was someone who was a count and his own patron, and they repaired the relationship. But here is a glimpse of everyday life in 18th century Bologna, where an elderly woman in the middle of washing laundry is screaming insults at a man publicly urinating on the wall, with this cat being equally indignant and swatting at him. In the background, a young mother feeding her child looks on, very amused. The beautifully painted details of the crumbling plaster, stockings, and copper pots adds to the scenery. He applied the same creative approach in his historical paintings of classical subjects. These two large canvases were executed earlier in his career, where he's looking towards Venetian works by late Titian and Tintoretto. They involve large figures in contention, closely intertwined, and filling up the composition. We can see his response to Venetian colorism, and the calligraphy of the brush is just exceptional. Things took a turn later in his career, where Crespi produces these bucolic scenes for his biblical and mythological subjects. They have an air of whimsy, as if he's poking fun at the emotional excesses of the stories and their conventional depictions. All classical decorum is out the window. Crespi is bringing us to a garden party for all intents and purposes. Crespi's pastoral scenes originated in a series of paintings of Diana's nymphs and Venus's cupids engaging in playful battle. Chastity versus love. Age-old story. This is where he shows off his sense of humor again. On the left, the cupids mock the sleeping nymphs and plunder their valuable jewelry. On the right, the nymphs get their revenge by snipping off the sleeping cupid's wings and stealing their bows and arrows. Crespi first painted the subject in his youth in 1690s and revisited the themes again some 30, 40 years later. He returned to painting pastoral subjects in the 1730s, but with a lighter palette and more elegant compositions. It is in this framework that Jupiter among the Corybantes was created. The story goes, to protect Jupiter from his father, Saturn, who, following a prophecy, had decided to swallow all his sons, his mother, Rhea, entrusted to Corybantes, who hid the child on the island of Crete and fed him goat milk. The nymphs clang little cymbals made of bronze, so that the cries of the infant Jupiter could not reach the ears of Saturn. The established iconography is completely ignored by Crespi. The Corybantes are male Greek warriors in armor. Instead, we get a bevy of young women in graceful attitudes in a sacred grove, and this is definitely not Crete. So as further proof that the subject is truly secondary to the pastoral scene, Crespi sent off this commission as a finding of Moses to avoid the higher tax applied on secular works of art, tax avoidance, so to speak. So the canvas on the left was commissioned by Stefano Conti of Lucca in 1728. And subsequently, Crespi redrew several of the figures into separate pastoral scenes. Other figures were reworked and improved. These works were likely continuous experiments with light and technique. As such, when he reprises the subject in the Kimbell painting years later, it is not a mere copy. Rather, all aspects of the work are fully refined. The biggest transformation being the work painted on copper instead of canvas. Rather than a traditional large format mythological painting, the copper panel is a much more intimate object. Differences in the compositional scheme extend beyond mere substitutions of a few figures. The execution of similar elements is far more refined and detailed in the copper panel. Compare the bold brushwork and heavy use of chiaroscuro with the sharper and more delicate rendering of the rosettes and draperies. The new version makes use of brighter tones with softer illumination washing over the scene. The paint has more of an enamel quality, and the figures are endowed with porcelain-like flesh tones. Crespi did away with some iconography, such as the carpet of rose petals. A few figures were replaced with more successful designs, such as this beautiful turned-away pose, pasted from the pastoral painting I showed earlier. Also, the expressions of the figures were originally much more traditional, as one would see in a typical history painting. By introducing some more loose, less dignified attire, the mood shifts even further into an Arcadia. Stylistically, the Kimbell picture reflects the emergent Rococo in the 1730s. Now, if you indulge me, I'd like to take a detour and give a more personal narrative of how I ended up working on this picture and why I think it was meant to be, so to say. Prior to working at the Kimbell, I was conservator in New York for the dispersed Samuel Crest collection. It's very hard to believe, but Italian Baroque pictures were generally overlooked by American collectors in the first half of the 20th century. Even Guercino, Gentileschi, Cagnacci, and if they worked outside of the Florence, Venice, Rome axis, then forget about it. The bulk of Crespi's in American institutions were as a result of collectors who purchased quality works beyond the prevailing trends because they were either heavily influenced by eminent art historians like Roberto Longhi, which was the case for Samuel Crest, or they were scholars themselves like William Suida. These Crest paintings ended up at the National Gallery of Art, El Paso, Coral Gables, Columbia, South Carolina, while the Suida Manning collection was gifted to our neighbors at the Blanton in Austin. So it is no surprise that a few years into Ted Pillsbury's tenure, in 1984, the Kimbell made its own move to acquire an And it's truly an exemplary work by Crespi. The newly discovered painting of outstanding quality and condition was probably a very easy decision. And if the Kimbell was the tastemaker, of course the Getty would follow with their own acquisition 2 years later. So I couldn't help myself. The acquisition tied into the major exhibition held at the Kimbell in 1986, Giuseppe Maria Crespi and the emergence of genre painting in Italy. To date, it remains the most important gathering of his works presented outside of Italy. The catalog is the first resource you would reach for if you'd like to learn more about the artist. I truly wish I had a time machine, among many other reasons, of course, but because an exhibition like this is a unique opportunity to admire some of Crespi's major works, often in pristine condition, which set the standard against which other works can be judged. In this gallery, I'd like to draw your attention to the smaller works. On the left, we have the Kimbell's Jupiter. And just on the other side is a lovely canvas depicting the rape of Europa. This painting was on loan from New York and privately owned by Mario and Diane Modestini. Just after the Kimbell exhibition, they published an extremely informative article detailing Crespi's technique and their examination of the works in the exhibition, which I'll come back to later. The late Mario was a great, prominent restorer and connoisseur. For 12 years, he was curator and conservator of the Samuel H. Kress collection, the very same that acquired 7 Crespis now gifted to American museums. Diane is a world-renowned restorer, best known for having restored Leonardo's Salvator Mundi. Luckily for me, she is my former colleague of nearly 7 years, and someone I call my mentor and dear friend. My deep appreciation of Crespi came directly from her and through my encounters with her paintings. So when I started working at the Kimbell in 2022, imagine my delight when I first saw this painting in the museum vault. I felt right at home. It is such a high quality work. And even better, it was dirty. Music to my ears, or rather yellow varnish to my eyes. It was one of the rare Kimbell paintings that was not cleaned upon acquisition. Over the decades, the painting only got darker and duller and completely lost the vibrancy Crespi was famous for. I was not subtle when I told our chief conservator, Peter Venter Mortel, I want to clean this. So happily he obliged, and that's the story of how I ended up restoring my first Kimbell painting. So the treatment was quite transformative and restored the delicate and luminous qualities of this work, as you can see in the before-after conservation treatment pictures. When I first saw the painting, it was overall still visible, but quite striking, but it did not live up to its full potential. It was essentially entombed under heavy layers of natural resin coatings, residues, and toning layers, which all contributed to the yellowed and dull appearance. Many heavy-handed retouchings dominated the delicate quality of the original passages. Many decades of aging aside, the surface never stood much of a chance. The varnish was excessively thick and clumsily applied. A thick mixture was essentially poured onto the surface. As a result, many disfiguring tide lines were very noticeable. Not that they tried very hard to begin with, but paintings on copper are particularly unforgiving when it comes to showing off every single surface imperfection. Here we have an ultraviolet light photograph captured before treatment, which shows off the extent of old restorations that were interfering with the image. The natural resin varnish brightly fluoresces green. And here you can clearly see the extent of the tight lines from the sloppily applied coating. The opaque green patches correspond to extensive toning and repainting that filled in the foliage and landscape, obscuring the original brushwork. The dark strokes and streaks littered across the surface indicate old retouchings. They were also clumsily done, and for the most part extend well beyond the original paint losses, especially in the canopy here. The varnish removal was an incredibly satisfying process where the full saturation of the colors and clarity of pictorial details begin to emerge. This is a photograph taken during cleaning where you can compare the differential impact of the yellow varnish had on various passages. The whole picture takes on a cooler tonality with an enhanced appreciation of the brushwork and complex layer structures. So this view gives you a better sense of the transformation to the surface texture and not just colors. The thick coating artificially exaggerated the unattractive orange peel texture, whereas a thinner varnish, which I put back on, would instead put the emphasis on the texture of the original brushstrokes. Perhaps even more satisfying than the varnish removal was the careful removal of wholesale overpainting that obscured the original details of the foliage. Crespi filled in the landscape with confident, loose brushwork. A restorer might have been misguided in renovating and going for a more finished appearance, but in the process making it look far more clumsy and muddy. To illustrate this, we'd have to zoom in. And the cleaning helped bring to light more nuanced details, such as the flushes of deep burgundy glazes in the foliage. There's now a noticeable contrast between strokes of cool gray and warm olive paint. In the upper left corner, this nondescript mass of brown overpaint was spread over original details. This unattractive smear of toxic green overpaint was covering up something much more refined. Crespi masterfully defined the texture of the tree bark with an effortless, fluid brushstroke that is a mere whisper. The modern eye very much celebrates this, skillful details like these, but 100 years ago, the prevailing taste was to aim for a more finished look. These are some other details before and after cleaning, where overpaint removal completely transformed the character of the foliage. We can now appreciate the energy and movement of the brushwork that composes the landscape. Certain details, such as these bright flushes of burgundy, were not only suppressed, but completely buried by the restorations. We also get a better sense of light coming through the foliage. The vegetation has regained a sense of layer and dimensionality, which prevents it from looking static. This painting was one of the rare instances where most of the overpaint removal was carried out under the microscope instead at the easel. Crespi's painting technique, which I'll go into detail later, presents quite the hazard for the restorer. The delicate glazes in the final modeling layers are easily obliterated by overcleaning. Many paintings have suffered from this and became a mere shadow of its original splendor. But the Kimbell picture has mostly escaped from that fate. In fact, it proved to be in excellent state. There are only some minor issues related to condition, including the presence of lead soaps throughout the painting. There have been dozens of PhDs, dissertations on this topic, but the elevator pitch is that as oil paint ages, lead-containing pigments react with free fatty acids in the oil medium to form lead soaps. These are responsible for the increased transparency of paint films. Often they can form aggregates that push upward and protrude to the surface and give rise to a granular texture. In these microscope images, they appear as light-colored pustules. They scatter light and can cause pinpoint losses. So these small losses created some visual snow that interfered with otherwise pristine paint, I was able to address many of the issues through precise and careful retouching. In the foreground, it was possible to knit the forms back together, which was quite a satisfying process to see more of the details reemerge. One area in particular pointed to the painting's lived history. There was evidence of a directional splatter, which forms if water or a strong solvent was left on the surface long enough to etch into the paint. Right here. But this was very easy to address through retouching because no major compositional elements were affected. Before treatment, the most clumsy-looking passage was the yellow canopy floating above the scenery. In contrast to the ethereal and light quality of the gauzy fabric, the large swaths of overpaint were quite heavy-handed, especially on the left-hand side, where the fabric melted into a featureless mass, devoid of structure. So the old restorations covered up paint losses that were a direct result of a natural process of degradation related to the mineral pigments or pigment and realgar. They made for precious and vibrant pigments, which were used in Italian Renaissance to render dazzling orange drapery. Unfortunately, it is in their inherent nature to undergo chemical degradation that rendered the paint weak and brittle. It was possible through much more careful retouching this time around to reconstruct the delicate structure of the missing canopy based on the remaining original paint. Zooming back to the overall picture, we can certainly appreciate the transformed qualities. The painting reemerged as an Arcadian landscape with a renewed sense of light and space. Instead of a flattened picture plane, the scenes recess into the far distance. The corner figures now stand out from the rest and anchor the foreground. An area like this truly demonstrates the impact of yellowed varnishes. They narrowed the tonal range by darkening the highlights and lightening the deep shadows. The treatment restored the warmth and depth of the dark areas. The flesh tones before cleaning appeared monotone. They are in reality far more sophisticated. There is now life and blood rushing through the figures with, bright flushes of pink in the knee and cheeks. There is a heightened clarity and contrast between the warm tones of the figures and the cool tones of the landscape. The dusty brown fabrics are actually different shades containing rich undertones of blue, purple, and apricot. A sense of internal light now emanates from the figures along with dynamic brushwork sculpting the faces and draperies. I was so pleased to uncover unexpected details in the foreground, such as the juxtaposition, of the pink flushes of light against the blue light rippling through the landscape, which only added to the bucolic character of the scenery. The dynamic brushwork of the foliage is more evident. They are more in line with the quality as seen in the rest of the picture. Instead of a muddy brown mass where everything collapses into a black hole, the details are much more refined and there is distinct sense of light piercing through the individual leaves. And finally, the orange canopy, formerly a weak point of the painting, has now regained its intended structure where the gentle folds catch the light. The fabric has a sense of translucency, airiness, and movement flapping in the wind. So the restoration provided the wonderful opportunity to closely re-examine painted details in a new light. For the rest of this lecture, we'll explore Crespi's his exquisite painting technique involving the sophisticated use of glazes, metal support, and unusual media outside of oil paint. A key contributing factor to the luminous paint surface begins with the painting support, which has its own reflective surface. During the early 16th century, Italian artists began experimenting with painting on hard, rigid supports that included stone, marble, and copper. By the 17th century, the practice of using copper supports had spread to the Low Countries and Northern Europe, Eastern Europe. So the paintings on copper sheets are certainly more rare and expensive than canvases or wood panels. There are 5 in the Kimbell's collection, including the Domenichino, Alzheimer, Walls, and Cavallino. Next time you're in the galleries, I invite you to study the rich enamel-like surfaces. To understand the differential effects of painting on different supports, let's compare these 2 works by Crespi from the same period, but on the left, copper, and on the right, canvas. They are both sensational, but have crucial distinctions in their characteristics. Size is a main one, where paintings on copper tend to be significantly smaller and can be jewel-like objects. So the metal provides a non-absorbent surface that fully retains the saturation of oil paint. The colors are more high-key, and the paint can be smoothly manipulated with the utmost precision. As such, it is often the supportive choice for painting in miniature. In contrast, canvas provides an absorbent and textured surface that lends better to painting in broad, expressive strokes. The copper allows Crespi to render the Madonna with refinement and luminosity, while on canvas, he portrays her with bravura brushwork. No hint of fussiness. Zooming in, what becomes abundantly clear is the textural difference between the enamel-like smoothness on the left and the coarse weave on the right. It is also worth keeping in mind that unlike canvases and wood panels, copper supports do not undergo dimensional changes in changing environments. Hence, you would not see craquelure in the paint layers. A great number of paintings on copper look absolutely pristine and appear as if they were painted yesterday. The same qualities are visible in the hands. I'm going to give you a second to take in these details. Truly, the best way to become acquainted with the unique qualities of paintings on copper is to see them in person. After some practice, you'd be able to spot them from across the gallery. So here's a selection of works on copper from across Crespi's career. I sized the thumbnails relative to their actual dimensions. The majority are intimately scaled cabinet pictures. The Kimbell painting is impressive in size. It is one of the largest works on copper painted by Crespi. The dimensions are typically limited by the cost of the material, what was commercially available to engravers and artists, and physics. As copper sheets get bigger, they will become more difficult to handle and flop under its own weight. So the copper was hammered flat into a thin sheet. A peak on the reverse of the painting shows the support is in excellent condition, which is a true testament to the material's durability. Canvases weaken over time and fail. Wood panels can develop structural issues like splits and wood-worm damage. This copper has the same structural integrity as it did 300 years ago, and with only some minor discoloration. At this point, a small corner at the top did snap off due to poor handling, but it was welded together. So this happened at some point in the past. But really, we're very lucky that's the extent of damage. There are fragments of old paper along the perimeter where a framer previously adhered newsprint. And this was rather unfortunate because the only corrosion products, green in color, correlate to where water-based adhesive was used to stick on the newsprint. However, it's mostly cosmetic. In fact, the deep reddish tone of the copper itself still predominate. You can probably begin to see these half-moon markings scattered across the surface. These are important physical evidence of the production method. The marks are better discerned under raking light. Copper plates were either rolled or hammered to make a flat support. Around this time, the majority were hammered because the use of rolling machines was not yet widespread. What you see here are shallow dents throughout the surface made by small round hammers. Together, they make these concentric rings that ripple out from the middle. The copper would have been hammered outwards until the desired thickness, or rather thinness, and then cut to shape. Together, so these, there were critical steps to prepare the copper plate to ensure good, lasting adhesion of the paint films to the metal support. If executed improperly, the paint layers would delaminate and flake off completely, which has happened to many paintings. First, the metal support was usually roughened. In infrared imaging, you can see these scratches as fine, dark lines in many scattered directions. In the copper distribution map obtained through X-ray fluorescence scanning, we could detect other linear incisions going up and down throughout the surface. Sometimes the plates were rubbed with garlic or oil before the priming was applied. The ground layer was often a thin coating of oil paint, sometimes bulked up with chalk. Treatises from the 17th and 18th centuries included the instructions for applying this layer with fingertips instead of a brush. This raking-like detail illustrates the prominent ridges that appear in certain areas of the painting, as if the preparation was applied with the palm of the hand. What is quite remarkable about this painting, and highly uncommon, is the color of the priming. The typical layer would be white or a light neutral color. Instead, we see this vibrant orange underlayer across the entire composition. The solid layer of opaque orange paint peeks through paint losses and areas of wear. And right beneath that is the copper plate. No, right here, you can see it. In a highly unusual but inventive move, Crespi used pure red lead to prepare the painting. Despite the name, red lead is a pigment that is bright orange in color. The prime surface of the painting wouldn't have been too far off from the warm hue of untarnished copper. Remember the use of this vivid orange, as this tone is subsequently utilized and carried to the surface of the finished picture. The choice of such a vibrant color amplifies the luminous qualities of the Kimbell picture. It provides a warm tonality to the finished painting, much like paintings with pink grounds. It has appeared in other works by Crespi, but not often. To illustrate the impact of the preparation, let's compare with two other works by Crespi on copper. The priming of the bottom painting is beige, whereas the top is green. The green ground serves as a middle tone that constitutes the horizon level in the sky and serves as the basis for the darker areas. Despite the paint layers being at the bottom, the entire tonality of this picture is impacted by this initial choice of color. During the buildup of paint layers, Crespi made several changes and adjustments to the composition of the figures. Technical imaging allowed us to visualize some of these pentiments and relate them to the initial version of Jupiter among the Corybantes on canvas. The sitting figures initially, so this sitting figure here initially wrapped her arm around the lamp. Instead of holding a basket of flowers, the kneeling figure had she had her arm across her lap, which was very cleverly reworked into a purple shawl. These features are visible, to different degrees in both infrared and the lead distribution maps. In addition, the mercury map, which corresponds to vermilion, clearly illustrates a more modest dress, which was later altered to show her nude back. These alterations can be traced back to the first version of the subject, executed years earlier. Crespi began the Kimbell picture closer to the other variant, but freely made changes along the way to fit his vision for the new painting. The same was the case with the billowing back of the dress, as well as a woman carrying a jug, which are absent from the Kimbell picture. The iron element map revealed that they were initially present, but edited out along the way to simplify the composition. Crespi was an enormously sophisticated painter. He was someone who had complete mastery over color theory and was inventive with his use of materials. His works have a delicate quality, but he applied paint with great confidence. Scanning across the surface of the picture, it's a master class in good painting techniques. To best illustrate this, let's zoom in and scan the picture from the perspective of a conservator doing close examination. If you'll indulge me in this last portion, I am going to flood the screen with a series of microscope images so we can collectively appreciate Crespi's skills. He is noted for his fluid, crisp brushwork. The canopy illustrates complete control in paint handling. Instead of blending wet and wet, he achieves subtle modeling through the singular application and manipulation of a layer of orange paint on top of a dark green underpaint. The brushwork becomes part of the fabric's texture. The shadows were later freely defined with deep glazes. A similar example is the lamp. The forms are sculpted in white paint with such skill and confidence. The most brilliant highlights were then modified in color by very subtle applications of yellow and red earth pigments. The draperies are a visual feast for the eyes. So this detail illustrates the complex and diverse layer structure of opaque and translucent paints. While there is no high impasto, the drapery folds are applied in thick pastos paint, textured by the brush. This is a prime example of keeping vibrant brushworks separate to maintain their intensity. Strokes of crisp colors lay side by side rather than muddling together. If you mix different shades together on the palette, eventually you get brown. So here, this vivid yellow keeps its strong tint as a pure glaze, which could not be the case if the pigment was mixed into the body of another paint. The hues are delicately modulated with the thinnest glazes and scumbles. Bear with me if you already know your color theory, but I'll briefly explain these concepts because the techniques are used over and over again. In this area here, we see the use of a dark glaze over an opaque underpaint to create a deep red color. A glaze is a paint containing transparent high tinting pigments. Because it is translucent, it modifies the shade of an existing paint layer. The underpaint alone reflects back a certain color. With the addition of the glaze, the reflected color still contains the underpaint, but with the addition of the pigment dye. The thicker the glaze, the more intense the color. The red is far more richly saturated if it's created by light filtering through a layer of pure glaze. It's the difference between observing a luminous color filtered through stained glass versus one printed on a piece of paper. Just nearby, we can observe the use of scumbling to create a lively highlight. A scumble is a very, very thin layer of light color paint applied over a dark color. Here, the dark red serves as the optical base for the delicate highlight. As light travels through the opaque pigments that form the scumble, blue light is scattered. Just this week, my toddler asked me, why is the sky blue? So light scattering. The particles in the atmosphere scatter shorter wavelengths, which translates to blue. The blue contribution combined with the dark red produces a cooler hue that reads almost purple. Believe it or not, the paint used for the scumbling layer is closer in color to this warm peachy pink along the top. Scumbling is a very neat optical trick where painters can introduce cool tones without using any blue pigments. Throughout the picture, the red draperies look so rich and vibrant because Crespi makes very liberal use of red glazes. The paint itself looks like cherry or strawberry jam. The detail on the left gives an indication of the transparent quality where it is thinly streaked on a light color. The red fabrics were painted with vermilion, a very vivid but opaque pigment. In the dark shadows, instead of mixing in black, which would produce a dark but flat-looking color, Crespi gave depth and intensity to the red by piling on the glaze. The use of red glazes was not just reserved for red passages. A detail of the blue drapery shows the complexity of Crespi's color layering. He starts with blue and white paint, but the body colors are further refined with subtle glazes of yellow-brown on the right and red on the left. There is not a hint of black or other opaque dark pigments. The red in combination with blue creates a shadow that is amazingly intense and multidimensional. We can observe how delicate these top layers are. They are a mere whisper of color. That's why we're so fortunate that the Kimbell picture is in good condition. Imagine if overzealous cleaning obliterated the glazes, which would be very easy to do. We would be left with a more conventional modeling of the drapery. Sadly, many of Crespi's paintings have suffered this fate and now appear a mere ghost of what they had been. In this detail, towards left, some midtones were created by modifying the highlights with a dark glaze. This is yet another example where it presents a hazard for the restorer. As this final modeling layer contains excess medium, it discolors easily and can be difficult to distinguish from an oxidized varnish. This makes these delicate passages particularly vulnerable during cleaning. Moving on from the draperies, the painting absolutely excels when it comes to fine details such as this bundle of flowers. Though Crespi was painting these elements in miniature, they were not done in a fussy or stilted manner. A range of opaque and translucent paints were dabbed on to create the lively foliage. The application is free but not random. These layered colors work in concert to create a compelling image. These rosettes are just, to die for, and the culmination of what sets Crespi apart. His use of glazes derived from Venetian painting cannot be sufficiently emphasized. The red glaze effortlessly flows from the folds of the brown drapery into the bundle of flowers. Where it pools in the rosette, it looks like dollops of jam. Not only is he layering together and blending paints of different colors and opacities, he is also seemingly using different painting media with varying optical and handling properties. So in their review of the Kimbell exhibition in 1986, Diane and Mario Modestini spoke extensively of Crespi's innovative use of resins and emulsions in addition to oil paint. Emulsions are combinations of an aqueous medium, such as egg, glue, or gum, emulsified with an oil or resin. Think mayonnaise. So in the exhibition, the works that used a luminous medium were clearly distinguishable from works or passages painted in oil. There's a good chance that we also see multiple painting media in this detail. The lighter underpainting of the leaves and rosettes is an oil paint, which has a pastier consistency and a texture that obviously retains the manipulation of the brush. But then we see these other strokes that are completely different in character. The medium, maybe emulsion, looks much more like enamel compared to the opaque passages of oil paint. This paint is much more liquid and flows from the brush onto the surface where it settles with rounded peaks. When glazed, it really could resemble porcelain. Lastly, the leaves were finished with a dark green glaze, which based on its observed behavior in some areas, I wonder if it might not be an aqueous medium instead of oil. Of the paintings I've studied, the only other time I saw this level of sophistication on such a small scale was when I worked on this early Canaletto. The work by chance was produced around the same date as the Kimbell's Crespi. The smallest figures were painted with both freeness and complexity. But even these details do not compete with the luminous qualities of the ones we looked at just before. It comes as no surprise that Canaletto joins this very exclusive club of painters whom generations of scholars have postulated must have used emulsions and other aqueous non-traditional painting media. The other, some of the artists include Jan van der Heyden. So oil medium reigns supreme since the latter part of the 15th century. However, there is much evidence to suggest that egg emulsions, or tempera grassa, continue to be used by artists well into the 19th century. But emulsion is certainly the white whale of conservation. It is a very complex organic medium. The identification through chemical analysis requires sampling, and its accuracy remains terribly problematic. However, we can still make visual analysis. In various highlights, we keep noticing paint of an entirely different character with an unusual flow and consistency. It appears translucent even when it contains lead white, which fits into egg medium having a higher refractive index. In oil, lead white makes a far more opaque paste. When a different medium is selectively applied, it often develops its own distinct texture and craquelure. In the left picture, the white highlight where it feathers out is not commingled with the oil paint below. In the right detail, the purple highlights appear to have microscopic air bubbles that are characteristic of an aqueous medium. In both examples, the paint appear more translucent and more porcelain-like in character. Why go through the trouble? In the end, Crespi had many more tools under his belt to bring the sophistication of his techniques to the next level. He painted with utmost refinement while also keeping everything dynamic. I love the details of the opaque white strokes on the cheeks, which serves as a shorthand depiction of light falling on her face. For other facial details, the semi-translucent glazes produce a slightly blurred sfumato effect. None of the facial features are sharply delineated. It is in the turned-away profiles that Crespi absolutely shines. The elegant attitudes are captured with such directness and confident strokes. Here, there is no room for second-guessing or adjustments. That flush of red at the base of her head, it just works. Most painters would struggle to execute in this manner without some feature ending up looking awkward. Despite not being a household name, Crespi's genius has long been recognized by connoisseurs. At the end of the day, he will always be appreciated as a sophisticated painter. I hope I've been able to provide a better framework through which we appreciate his works, especially the jewel-like qualities in the Kimbell painting. A truly great painter like Crespi not only invites people to look, but also inspire them to pick up their own brush and begin playing around with paint. So